Modest Petrovich Mussorgsky was a Russian composer, one of the group known as the Five. He was an innovator of Russian music in the Romantic period. He strove to achieve a uniquely Russian musical identity, often in deliberate defiance of the established conventions of Western music. Many of his works were inspired by Russian history, Russian folklore, and other nationalist themes. Such works include the opera Boris Godunov, the orchestral tone poem Night on Bald Mountain, and the piano suite Pictures at an Exhibition. For many years Mussorgsky's works were mainly known in versions revised or completed by other composers. Many of his most important compositions have latterly come into their own in their original forms, and some of the original scores are now also available. Name. The speaking and pronunciation of the composer's name has occasioned some confusion. The family name derives from a 15th or 16th century ancestor, Roman Vasilievich Monastyryov, who appears in the Velvet Book, the 17th century genealogy of Russian boyars. Roman Vasilievich bore the nickname Mussorga, and was the grandfather of the first Mussorgsky. The composer could trace his lineage to Rurik, the legendary 9th century founder of the Russian state. In Mussorgsky family documents the speaking of the name varies. Mussorgsky, Mussorgsky, Mussorgskoy, Mussorgskoy, Mussorgsky, and Mussorgsky. The baptismal record gives the composer's name as Mussorgsky. In early letters to Mily Balakirov, the composer signed his name Mussorgsky. The G made its first appearance in a letter to Balakirov in 1863. Mussorgsky used this new spelling to the end of his life, but occasionally reverted to the earlier Mussorgsky. The addition of the G to the name was likely initiated by the composer's elder brother Filaret to obscure the resemblance of the name's root to an unsavory Russian word. Debris, rubbish. Refuse. Mussorgsky apparently did not take the new spelling seriously, and played on the rubbish connection in letters to Vladimir Stasov and to Stasov's family, routinely signing his name Musyanin, roughly, garbage dweller. The first syllable of the name originally received the stress, and is so to this day in Russia and in the composer's home district. The addition of the G, and the accompanying shift in stress to the second syllable, sometimes described as a Polish variant, was supported by Filaret Mussorgsky's descendants until his line ended in the 20th century. Their example was followed by many influential Russians, such as Fyodor Shaliapin, Nikolai Golovanov, and Tikhon Khrennikov, who, perhaps dismayed that the great composer's name was a reminiscent of garbage, supported the erroneous second-syllable stress that has also become entrenched in the West. The Western convention of doubling the first S, which is not observed in scholarly literature, likely arose because in many Western European languages a single intervocalic per second often becomes voiced to Z, unlike in Slavic languages where it remains unvoiced. Doubling the consonant thus reinforces its voiceless sibilant per second sound. Life. Early years. Mussorgsky was born in Kharovo, Toropets-Uyezd, Pskov Governorate, Russian Empire, 400 kilometers south of St. Petersburg. His wealthy and landowning family, the noble family of Mussorgsky, is reputedly descended from the first Ruthenian ruler, Rurik, through the sovereign princes of Smolensk. At age 6, Mussorgsky began receiving piano lessons from his mother, herself a trained pianist. His progress was sufficiently rapid that 3 years later he was able to perform a John Field concerto and works by Franz Liszt for family and friends. At 10, he and his brother were taken to St. Petersburg to study at the elite German-language Petrischule. While there, Modest studied the piano with the noted Anton Gurk. In 1852, the 12-year-old Mussorgsky published a piano piece titled Portensine Polka at his father's expense. Mussorgsky's parents planned the move to St. Petersburg so that both their sons would renew the family tradition of military service. To this end, Mussorgsky entered the cadet school of the Guards at age 13. Sharp controversy had arisen over the educational attitudes at the time of both this institute and its director, a General Sugoff. All agreed the cadet school could be a brutal place, especially for new recruits. More tellingly for Mussorgsky, it was likely where he began his eventual path to alcoholism. According to a former student, singer and composer Nikolai Kompaniysky, Sugoff was proud when a cadet returned from leave drunk with champagne. Music remained important to him, however. Sugoff's daughter was also a pupil of Herka, and Mussorgsky was allowed to attend lessons with her. His skills as a pianist made him much in demand by fellow cadets. For them he would play dances interspersed with his own improvisations. In 1856, Mussorgsky, who had developed a strong interest in history and studied German philosophy, graduated from the cadet school. Following family tradition, he received a commission with the Preobrazhensky Regiment, the foremost regiment of the Russian Imperial Guard. Maturity. In October 1856, the 17-year-old Mussorgsky met the 22-year-old Alexander Borodin while both men served at a military hospital in St. Petersburg. The two were soon on good terms. Borodin later remembered, his little uniform was spick and span, close-fitting, his feet turned outwards, his hair smoothed down and greased, his nails perfectly cut, his hands well-groomed like a lord's. His manners were elegant, aristocratic, his speech likewise, delivered through somewhat clenched teeth, interspersed with French phrases, rather precious. There was a touch, though very moderate, of foppishness. His politeness and good manners were exceptional. The ladies made a fuss of him. He sat at the piano and, throwing up his hands coquettishly, played with extreme sweetness and grace extracts from Trovata, Traviata, and so on. And around him buzzed in chorus, Charmant, Delicieux, and such like. I met Modest Petrovich 3 or 4 times at Popov's in this way, both on duty and at the hospital. More portentous was Mussorgsky's introduction that winter to Alexander Dargo-Mijski, at that time the most important Russian composer after Mikhail Glinka. Dargo-Mijski was impressed with Mussorgsky's pianism. As a result, Mussorgsky became a fixture at Dargo-Mijski's soirees. There, critic Vladimir Stasov later recalled, he began his true musical life over the next 2 years at Dargo-Mijski's. Mussorgsky met several figures of importance in Russia's cultural life, among them Stasov, Yakut Sarsway, and Mily Balakirov. Balakirov had an especially strong impact. Within days he took it upon himself to help shape Mussorgsky's fate as a composer. He recalled to Stasov, because I am not a theorist, I could not teach him harmony. But I explained to him the form of compositions, and to do this we played through both Beethoven's symphonies, as piano duets, and much else. Analyzing the form, up to this point Mussorgsky had known nothing but piano music. His knowledge of more radical recent music was virtually non-existent. Balakirov started filling these gaps in Mussorgsky's knowledge. In 1858, within a few months of beginning his studies with Balakirov, Mussorgsky resigned his commission to devote himself entirely to music. He also suffered a painful crisis at this time. This may have had a spiritual component, but its exact nature will probably never be known. In 1859, the 20-year-old gained valuable theatrical experience by assisting in a production of Glinka's opera Life for the Tsar on the Glebovo estate of a former singer and her wealthy husband. He also met Konstantin Lyadov and enjoyed a formative visit to Moscow, after which he professed a love of everything Russian. In spite of this epiphany, Mussorgsky's music still leaned more toward foreign models. A four-hand piano sonata which he produced in 1860 contains his only movement in sonata form, nor is any nationalistic impulse easily discernible in the incidental music for Vladislav Ozarov's play Oedipus in Athens. on which he worked between the ages of 19 and 22, or in the Intermezzo in modo classico for piano solo. The latter was the only important piece he composed between December 1860 and August 1863. The reasons for this probably lie in the painful re-emergence of his subjective crisis in 1860 and the purely objective difficulties which resulted from the emancipation of the serfs the following year, as a result of which the family was deprived of half its estate, and Mussorgsky had to spend a good deal of time in Karakow unsuccessfully attempting to stave off their looming impoverishment. By this time, Mussorgsky had freed himself from the influence of Balakirev and was largely teaching himself. In 1863 he began an opera, Salammbô, on which he worked between 1863 and 1866 before losing interest in the project. During this period he had returned to St. Petersburg and was supporting himself as a low-grade civil servant while living in a six-man commune. In a heady artistic and intellectual atmosphere, he read and discussed a wide range of modern artistic and scientific ideas, including those of the provocative writer Chernyshevsky, known for the bold assertion that innate form and content are opposites. Under such influences he came more and more to embrace the ideal of artistic realism and all that it entailed, whether this concerned the responsibility to depict life as it is truly lived, the preoccupation with the lower strata of society, or the rejection of repeating, symmetrical musical forms as insufficiently true to the unrepeating, unpredictable course of real life. Real life affected Mussorgsky painfully in 1865. When his mother died, it was at this point that the composer had his first serious bout of alcoholic dipsomania. The 26-year-old was, however, on the point of writing his first realistic songs. 1867 was also the year in which he finished the original orchestral version of his Night on Bald Mountain. Peak Mussorgsky's career as a civil servant was by no means stable or secure, though he was assigned to various posts and even received a promotion in these early years. In 1867 he was declared supernumerary, remaining in service but receiving no wages. Decisive developments were occurring in his artistic life, however, although it was in 1867 that Stasov first referred to the Kuchka of Russian composers loosely grouped around Balakirev. Mussorgsky was by then ceasing to seek Balakirev's approval and was moving closer to the older Alexander Dogomyshsky. Since 1866 Dogomyshsky had been working on his opera The Stone Guest, a version of the Don Juan story with a Pushkin text that he declared would be set just as it stands, so that the inner truth of the text should not be distorted, and in a manner that abolished the unrealistic division between aria and recitative in favor of a continuous mode of syllabic but lyrically heightened declamation somewhere between the two. Under the influence of this work, Mussorgsky in 1868 rapidly set the first 11 scenes of Nikolai Gogol's The Marriage, with his priority being to render into music the natural accents and patterns of the play's naturalistic and deliberately humdrum dialogue. This work marked an extreme position in Mussorgsky's pursuit of naturalistic word setting. He abandoned it unorchestrated after reaching the end of his Act 1, and though its characteristically Mussorgskyan declamation is to be heard in all his later vocal music, the naturalistic mode of vocal writing more and more became merely one expressive element among many. A few months after abandoning Zhenitbar, the 29-year-old Mussorgsky was encouraged to write an opera on the story of Boris Godunov. This he did, assembling and shaping a text from Pushkin's play and Karamzin's history. He completed the large-scale score the following year while living with friends and working for the forestry department. In 1871, however, the finished opera was rejected for theatrical performance, apparently because of its lack of any prima donna role. Mussorgsky set to work producing a revised and enlarged second version. During the next year, which he spent sharing rooms with Rimsky-Korsakov, he made changes that went beyond those requested by the theatre. In this version the opera was accepted, probably in May 1872, and 3 excerpts were staged at the Mariinsky Theatre in 1873. It is often asserted that in 1872 the opera was rejected a second time, but no specific evidence for this exists. By the time of the first production of Boris Godunov in February 1874, Mussorgsky had taken part in the ill-fated Marder project and had begun Corvinchchina. Though far from being a critical success, and in spite of receiving only a dozen or so performances, the popular reaction in favor of Boris made this the peak of Mussorgsky's career. Decline. From this peak a pattern of decline becomes increasingly apparent. Already the Balakirev circle was disintegrating. Mussorgsky was especially bitter about this. He wrote to Vladimir Stasov, "He mighty handful has degenerated into solus traitors, in drifting away from his old friends." Mussorgsky had been seen to fall victim to fits of madness, so that could well have been alcoholism-related. His friend Viktor Hartmann had died, and his relative and recent roommate Arseny Golenishev-Kutuzov had moved away to get married. While alcoholism was Mussorgsky's personal weakness, it was also a behavior pattern considered typical for those of Mussorgsky's generation who wanted to oppose the establishment and protest through extreme forms of behavior. One contemporary notes, an intense worship of Bacchus was considered to be almost obligatory for a writer of that period. It was a showing off, a pose, for the best people of the 1860s. In other rights, talented people in Russia who love the simple folk cannot but drink. Mussorgsky spent day and night in a St. Petersburg tavern of low repute, the Malý Yaroslavets, accompanied by other Bohemian dropouts. He and his fellow drinkers idealized their alcoholism, perhaps seeing it as ethical and aesthetic opposition. This bravado, however, led to little more than isolation and eventual self-destruction. For a time Mussorgsky was able to maintain his creative output. His compositions from 1874 include Sunless, the Corvinchchina Prelude, and the piano suite Pictures at an Exhibition. He also began work on another opera based on Gogol, The Fair at Sorokintsy. In the years that followed, Mussorgsky's decline became increasingly steep. Although now part of a new circle of eminent personages that included singers, medical men and actors, he was increasingly unable to resist drinking, and a succession of deaths among his closest associates caused him great pain. At times, however, his alcoholism would seem to be in check, and among the most powerful works composed during his last 6 years are the 4 songs and dances of death. His civil service career was made more precarious by his frequent illnesses and absences, and he was fortunate to obtain a transfer to a post where his music-loving superior treated him with great leniency, in 1879 even allowing him to spend 3 months touring 12 cities as a singer's accompanist. The decline could not be halted, however. In 1880 he was finally dismissed from government service. Aware of his destitution, one group of friends organized a stipend designed to support the completion of Corvinchchina. Another group organized a similar fund to pay him to complete the fair at Sorokintsy. However, neither work was completed. In early 1881, a desperate Mussorgsky declared to a friend that there was nothing left but begging, and suffered 4 seizures in rapid succession. Though he found a comfortable room in a good hospital, and for several weeks even appeared to be rallying, the situation was hopeless. Repin painted the famous red-nosed portrait in what were to be the last days of the composer's life. A week after his 42nd birthday, he was dead. He was interred at the Tikhvin cemetery of the Alexander Nevsky Monastery in St. Petersburg. In 1935–37, in connection with the reconstruction and redevelopment of the so-called necropolis of Masters of Arts, The square in front of the Lavra was substantially extended and the borderline of the Tikvan cemetery was accordingly moved. The Soviet government, however, moved only gravestones to a new location, and the tombs were covered with asphalt, including Mussorgsky's grave. The burial place of Mussorgsky is now a bus stop. Mussorgsky, like others of the Five, was perceived as extremist by the emperor and much of his court. This may have been the reason Tsar Alexander III personally crossed off Boris Godunov from the list of proposed pieces for the imperial opera in 1888.